November 12, 1942, 4:47 hours, the Libyan desert. Captain Michael Harrington's hands trembled on the radio transmitter inside his Churchill tank. Outside, the steel hull shuddered as German 88mm shells tore through the pre-dawn darkness. His crew was pinned, 3 panzers advancing, ammunition low, nowhere to run on the flat expanse of sand. Then he spoke 6 words that would change warfare forever. "Falcon Leader, this is Steel 2, target coordinates 329547, request immediate strike." 23 seconds of static, the longest silence of his life. Then a crackling British voice. "Steel 2, Falcon Leader, inbound 30 seconds." Harrington pressed his face to the periscope. High above, barely visible against the violet sky, 4 Hurricane fighter bombers banked hard, their engines screaming as they dove toward the German armor. The Panzers never saw them coming. Within 90 seconds, rocket fire erupted across the dunes. German tanks exploded in plumes of fire and black smoke. Harrington's radio crackled again. "Steel 2, targets neutralized. You're clear." He exhaled. For the first time in history, a tank commander had called lightning from the sky. This is the story of Operation Cascade, the classified experiment that gave birth to modern combined arms warfare, decades before anyone knew it existed. If you love untold stories from the shadows of history, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand how revolutionary this moment was, you need to understand the nightmare that preceded it. By late 1942, the North African campaign had become a brutal war of attrition. British and American tank crews faced Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose Africa Corps had mastered the art of armored warfare. His Panzer IIIs and IVs, supported by the feared 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed as tank killers, dominated the battlefield. Allied Sherman and Churchill tanks were outgunned. Their 75mm guns struggled to penetrate German armor at range, while Rommel's tanks could kill from over a mile away. Worse still, the desert offered no cover, just endless sand, rock, and scorching sun. Tank crews called it fighting naked. Air support existed, yes. RAF Hurricane and Kitty Hawk squadrons flew ground attack missions. But coordination was primitive, almost medieval. Pilots relied on pre-planned strikes against pre-selected targets. By the time aircraft arrived, German units had often moved. Tanks and planes fought the same war, but on different frequencies, literally and figuratively. The communication barrier was technological, but also doctrinal. The British Army and RAF operated as separate entities. Tank commanders had no direct line to pilots. If a panzer division appeared suddenly, there was no way to call for help. You fought with what you had, or you died. But in a signals tent near El Alamein, a handful of engineers were about to crack that barrier wide open. His name was Major Geoffrey Clark, a Royal Signals officer who'd spent the early war years tinkering with radio equipment in England. Clark had noticed something the brass hadn't. Tank radios and aircraft radios weren't that different anymore. The British 19 wireless set, standard issue in Churchill and Sherman tanks, operated on frequencies that could theoretically be adapted to communicate with RAF ground control frequencies. The technology existed. The problem was protocol, bureaucracy, and the fact that nobody had ever tried it in combat. Clark wasn't supposed to be experimenting. He was supposed to be maintaining existing communication lines. But the mounting casualties haunted him. Every night he'd see burned-out tank hulks towed back to base. Every morning he'd hear pilots frustrated that their strikes hit empty desert because intelligence was hours old. So in September 1942, without formal approval, Clark began modifying tank radios in secret. He requisitioned parts under vague justifications, worked after hours, and recruited two trusted technicians, Sergeant Peter Holloway and Corporal James Mackenzie. Together, they jury-rigged a system, a modified transmitter that could patch a tank commander directly to a forward air controller, a new role Clark himself proposed. The concept was simple. Embed a trained RAF officer with frontline tank units equipped with a modified radio. That officer would relay targeting coordinates from tankers to circling aircraft in real time. Simple in theory, insane in practice. The desert was about to become their testing ground. Clark needed guinea pigs, tank commanders willing to test an unauthorized system that might get them killed. He found them in the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats. These were veterans who'd seen hell. They'd watched friends burn alive in metal coffins. If someone offered them an edge, even an experimental one, they'd take it. Captain Michael Harrington, 29 years old, commander of a Churchill tank nicknamed Iron Duke, volunteered first. He'd lost his younger brother, also a tanker, 3 months prior. "If this works," Harrington told Clark, "we save lives. If it doesn't, at least we tried." Clark embedded Flight Lieutenant Adrian Wells, a former Hurricane pilot grounded after a crash injury, as the first forward air controller. Wells rode in a modified Humber armored car equipped with Clark's experimental radio rig, positioned just behind the frontline tanks. The system was clunky. Voice quality was poor. There was no encryption, so theoretically Germans could listen. Range was limited to about 15 miles, and nobody knew if it would work under combat stress. In early November 1942, British High Command was focused on the aftermath of El Alamein, where Montgomery had finally broken Rommel's lines. The Africa Corps was retreating west, but they weren't defeated, just regrouping. Clark's team named their experiment Operation Cascade because, if successful, strikes would cascade from sky to earth like thunder following lightning. The first real test came on November 12th, at dawn. Before sunrise, Harrington's squadron, 12 Churchill tanks, moved into position near the coastal town of Tobruk. Intelligence suggested a German supply column would pass through the area. What intelligence didn't mention? The supply column was guarded by 8 Panzer IVs. Harrington spotted them first through the pre-dawn haze. German tanks arranged in a defensive screen, protecting trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition. His squadron was outgunned and outnumbered. Standard procedure: retreat, report, wait for orders. But Harrington had Clark's modified radio. And somewhere above, hidden in the dark sky, 4 Hurricane Mk2s circled, armed with rockets and 40mm cannons. He made the call. "Falcon Leader, this is Steel 2. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Flight Lieutenant Wells, 300 yards behind in his Humber, relayed refined coordinates to the Hurricane squadron leader, adjusting for wind and German movement. The response crackled back. "Steel 2, Falcon Leader, inbound, 30 seconds. Harrington ordered his tanks to hold position and mark targets with tracer fire. The Germans, seeing British tanks suddenly stop and fire tracers into the air, were confused. Confusion turned to terror 28 seconds later. The Hurricanes descended like hawks, rockets screaming from their wings. The first Panzer exploded before its crew could react. The second, attempting to maneuver, was shredded by cannon fire. Operation Cascade's first mission was a devastating success. Word spread like wildfire through British ranks. Within 48 hours, 5 more tank squadrons requested access to Clark's system. The problem? Clark had only built 3 modified radio sets. He hadn't anticipated success, let alone demand. He worked frantically, scavenging parts from damaged equipment, training more forward air controllers, briefing pilots who'd never communicated directly with ground forces before. Sleep became optional. Clark survived on tea, cigarettes, and the knowledge that his invention was saving lives. But success bred attention, and not all of it welcome. British High Command finally noticed. A brigadier arrived at Clark's tent demanding explanations for unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Clark expected arrest. Instead, the brigadier studied the after-action reports from Harrington's engagement. 8 enemy tanks destroyed, 0 British casualties. Mission accomplished in under 4 minutes. The brigadier lit his pipe and said, "Carry on, Major, but for God's sake, make it official." Operation Cascade received formal authorization on November 18, 1942, classified at the highest level. The reason for secrecy: if the Germans discovered this capability and adapted their tactics or developed countermeasures, the advantage would vanish. Clark was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given resources, more technicians, better equipment, priority access to RAF squadrons. The experiment was over. The operation was real. But Rommel's intelligence officers were already noticing something strange happening in the desert. After-action reports began mentioning unnaturally precise British airstrikes. Panzer commanders reported aircraft appearing within minutes of engaging British armor, as if summoned. One German officer wrote in his diary, "They fight as one machine, tanks, guns, and sky. It is as though the British can see through clouds." Rommel himself reviewed these reports with growing concern. The Desert Fox had built his reputation on maneuver warfare. Strike fast, withdraw faster. But if British tanks could call immediate air support, his mobility advantage eroded. He ordered radio silence during engagements and dispersed formations to minimize airstrike effectiveness. It helped, but not enough. On November 24th, a German supply convoy escorted by Panzer IIIs was caught in open desert by a British armored patrol. The Panzers prepared to engage. They had the advantage in firepower and positioning. Then the sky erupted. Kitty Hawk fighter bombers, directed by Forward Air Controller Captain Simon Rhodes, embedded with the British tanks, struck with surgical precision. The German commander, Major Wilhelm Becker, survived but was captured. During interrogation, he asked the question that haunted him: "How did you call them so fast?" The British interrogator smiled and said nothing. Becker would spend the rest of the war trying to understand what had happened. Allied intelligence made sure he never found out. Because Operation Cascade's greatest weapon wasn't the technology, it was the Germans nicht wissen, dass es existiert. By December 1942, Operation Cascade had expanded to 18 tank squadrons and 12 dedicated forward air controllers. But expansion brought complications. Radio discipline became critical. Every transmission risked German interception. Clark instituted code systems. Cascade became waterfall. Coordinates were encrypted using daily changing ciphers, and pilots were instructed to never acknowledge the source of targeting information over open channels. Human factors emerged too. Not every tank commander adapted well to the new system. Some were old-school officers who distrusted fancy wireless tricks. Others struggled with the pressure of coordinating with aircraft while fighting for their lives. Flight Lieutenant Adrian Wells, the first forward air controller, described the psychological intensity. "You're translating between two different worlds at war. The tanker is screaming coordinates while shells impact around him. The pilot is flying at 300 miles per hour trying to locate a target in endless brown sand. You're the bridge. If you fail, men die." The stress broke some men. 2 forward air controllers requested transfers after breakdowns. One pilot, after accidentally striking a British position due to garbled coordinates, never flew combat missions again. Clark implemented better training protocols, stress management, and clearer communication standards.
But the biggest challenge wasn't technical or psychological. It was strategic. The question every commander asked: how long could they keep this secret? January 1943. The North African campaign entered its final phase. Rommel's Afrika Korps, squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west, fought desperately. Every battle mattered. Every loss compounded. Operation Cascade intensified. British and American tank units, now jointly using the system after Clark briefed U.S. Army officers, coordinated devastating combined strikes. German formations attempting to retreat were caught in killing zones, pounded from the ground and sky simultaneously. But the strain showed. Clark's team operated on fumes. Radio equipment broke down in desert heat and sandstorms. Replacement parts took weeks to arrive. Several forward air controllers were killed when their vehicles were targeted by German artillery. The enemy might not understand the system, but they recognized certain vehicles staying close to frontline tanks and drew conclusions. Captain Michael Harrington, the first volunteer, survived 3 more engagements using cascade coordination. His Churchill tank, Iron Duke, became legendary, the tank that never lost a fight. Soldiers believed it was invincible. On January 22, 1943, Harrington's luck ran out. His squadron encountered a German rearguard position. 4 Panzer IVs dug into defensive positions. Harrington called for air support. Flight Lieutenant Wells relayed coordinates. But this time, the Germans were ready. They'd been studying British patterns, and they'd laid a trap. The Hurricanes dove toward the German position as planned. But hidden among the dunes, camouflaged with expert precision, sat 4 German flak 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The moment the British aircraft committed to their attack run, the 88s opened fire. The lead Hurricane disintegrated mid-air. The second took catastrophic damage and spiraled into the sand. The third and fourth pilots broke off, but the damage was done. Harrington watched in horror through his periscope as the aircraft he'd summoned fell from the sky. Worse, without air support, his squadron was exposed. The Panzer IVs, unharmed, now turned their attention to the British tanks. The engagement became brutal. Iron Duke took 2 direct hits but kept fighting. Harrington's gunner knocked out 1 Panzer. But German reinforcements arrived, more tanks, more anti-tank guns. Harrington made the hardest call of his life. All units, withdraw. Repeat, withdraw. 3 British tanks were destroyed covering the retreat. 17 men died. That night, back at base, Harrington sat alone beside his damaged tank. Wells found him there. "We pushed too hard," Harrington said quietly. "Got too confident." Wells lit 2 cigarettes, handed one to Harrington. "The system works, but the Germans are learning." It was true. Operation Cascade's secret was eroding. The question was, could they end the campaign before Rommel fully understood what he was facing? March 1943. The end approached. Rommel, sick and defeated, was recalled to Germany. His replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, inherited an impossible situation. 250,000 Axis troops trapped in Tunisia, supplies dwindling, Allied forces closing in from all sides. Operation Cascade entered its final, most intensive phase. Clark's team coordinated over 40 combined strikes in a single week. The system that had been experimental 6 months ago was now doctrine. Every Allied tank unit in North Africa had access to forward air controllers. Pilots and tankers spoke the same language. The Germans noticed patterns but never cracked the code. Their intelligence officers theorized everything from secret radar installations to psychic espionage. Some came close to the truth, suspecting radio communication between ground and air, but lacked evidence. On May 7, 1943, during the final assault on Tunis, Captain Michael Harrington participated in his last mission. His squadron, reinforced and rebuilt, pushed toward the city alongside American Sherman tanks. German resistance was fierce but fragmented. Every counterattack met devastating air support, called within minutes by forward air controllers who'd perfected their craft. Harrington's tank fired its last shots at 14:37 hours. The German position collapsed. By evening, white flags appeared across the battlefield. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. The Desert War was over. Operation Cascade had helped write its final chapter. The true impact revealed itself slowly. Post-war analysis showed that Operation Cascade had directly contributed to over 1,200 enemy vehicle destructions and significantly accelerated the Allied victory timeline. British losses and engagements utilizing the system were 40% lower than standard operations. But the strategic revelation went deeper. Major Jeffrey Clark's improvised radio coordination system became the blueprint for close air support doctrine, the foundation of modern combined arms warfare. Every military in the world today uses variations of what Clark invented in a desert tent. The technology itself wasn't revolutionary. Radio communication existed, aircraft existed, tanks existed. Clark's genius was integration, understanding that wars are won not by individual systems, but by connecting them, by making separate forces fight as one organism. The U.S. military studied Operation Cascade intensely after the war. It influenced development of tactical air control systems in Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. Modern forward air controllers, equipped with digital radios and GPS coordinates, are descendants of Flight Lieutenant Adrian Wells calling strikes from his armored Humber. Even the terminology persisted. Cascade became military shorthand for coordinated air-ground strikes that escalate in intensity, strikes that cascade from sky to earth. But during the war, Operation Cascade remained classified. The British feared Soviet intelligence or future enemies discovering the methodology. Documentation was limited, deliberately vague. Most participants were sworn to secrecy. Captain Michael Harrington never spoke publicly about his role. After North Africa, he fought through Italy and into Germany, surviving the war. He returned to England, married, raised 3 children, worked as a civil engineer. When friends asked about his military service, he'd say, "I drove a tank. We did our bit." He never mentioned the moment he called lightning from the sky. Major, later Colonel, Jeffrey Clark received a quiet commendation and was transferred to British Signals Development, where he continued improving military communications until his retirement in 1962. He published no memoirs, gave no interviews. Only decades later, when documents were gradually declassified, did historians piece together Operation Cascade's story. Flight Lieutenant Adrian Wells became a flight instructor after the war, training the next generation of pilots in ground coordination techniques, though he never explained where those techniques originated. Of the 12 original forward air controllers, 3 died in combat. The rest carried the secret until classified files were opened in the 1980s and 90s. Why the secrecy, even after the war? Because the concept was too valuable. If future adversaries understood exactly how it worked, they'd develop countermeasures. By keeping it classified, the Allies ensured that their doctrinal advantage lasted decades beyond World War II. The silence protected more than history. It protected the future. The human cost and triumph intertwined. 23 British and American soldiers directly involved in Operation Cascade died during its operational period. 7 aircraft were lost in coordinated strikes.
These men paid the price of innovation, testing a system in combat where failure meant death. But the lives saved numbered in the thousands. Tank crews who would have been destroyed by superior German armor survived because help arrived from above within minutes instead of hours. Pilots who would have bombed empty desert hit precise targets, maximizing their effectiveness and minimizing wasted sorties. The psychological impact on both sides proved significant. Allied tank crews developed confidence, even against superior German panzers. They knew they weren't alone. That knowledge affected tactical decisions, willingness to engage, and overall morale. German forces experienced the opposite, creeping uncertainty. Rommel's war diaries mention the frustration of fighting an enemy that seemed to have eyes in the sky. The inability to understand or counter Operation Cascade contributed to the psychological erosion of Afrika Korps' effectiveness. After North Africa, the system expanded to every theater. Modified for European terrain, adapted for Pacific jungles, refined for D-Day operations. By 1944, close air support was standard Allied doctrine. The improvised experiment from a desert tent had become foundational military science. Clark's cigarette smoke solution to a deadly problem had rewritten how wars were fought. Forever.
Today, if you watch footage of modern military operations, you see Operation Cascade's legacy. A soldier on the ground communicates with aircraft overhead, calling precision strikes within minutes. A tank commander coordinates with helicopter gunships. A drone operator receives targeting data from infantry units. They're all using refinements of Jeffrey Clark's improvised system from 1942. The technology evolved: digital radios, satellite communications, GPS precision, computer-assisted targeting. But the concept remained identical. Integrate ground and air forces, allow them to communicate directly, enable real-time coordination. Operation Cascade proved that innovation in warfare isn't always about better weapons. Sometimes it's about better connections, better communication, better teamwork. The men who created and tested this system, Clark, Harrington, Wells, and dozens of others, didn't seek glory. They saw a problem, improvised a solution, risked their lives testing it. Most died without recognition. Their families often didn't know what they'd accomplished. But their legacy flies overhead every time a soldier in danger calls for help and hears, "Inbound, 30 seconds." Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and military records. In the silence of the desert night, after the last battle ended, radio waves still whispered through the darkness, carrying voices that had learned to turn the sky into a weapon, and in doing so had changed war forever. If this hidden chapter of history moved you, share this story. Subscribe so these forgotten voices continue to be heard, because some secrets deserve to be known.